it off.
It is recording. Okay.
Yeah. You maybe have your Zoom's automatic settings to record, as I do for classes and such.
Good.
So Bob, what's the new book? It's in, I just see it as NHTDG.
That's the New Haven Theological Discussion Group.
Ah, I see. Yeah.
That's what I used this for as a paper for presentation a month or so ago. But it's really a philosophy paper, and the as I will explain, the title of the volume is the very exciting one of essays. But I can talk about that a little bit. I thought that I would read the first 3 pages of this, which is a pretty good synopsis. And if others have read more than 3 pages, that's really fine. If they give up after 3 pages, well, they've done their job for.
And you all are getting all the, I mean, you're here, so I'm assuming you are, but the emails with the invitation links and the like. So.
Yes, good work. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Richard.
Hi, George. Hello, everyone.
Oh, hello,
Richard.
Richard.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
May, are you there?
At least seeing is possible.
Yes.
There's Brian.
Perhaps it will get better soon. Go beyond that. And hearing.
Yes, agreed. A return to an in-person meeting would be very nice.
Brian.
Hello.
Ryan, how are you and where are you at the moment?
Are you speaking to me?
No, to Brian Martin.
Oh, I'm in Savannah.
Savannah. Okay.
Yes.
What takes you to
Nice
Savannah?
city.
I live here.
It's a very nice place.
It is indeed.
Yes.
Hello, Owen. How are you? Melanie?
Hello.
Oh, and you matched your shirt with your background.
Hello, Jason.
Yes.
Professor Neville, how you doing?
Okay.
Good to see you.
Right, how are you?
Pretty good.
Oh,
Our screens are all flashing.
yes. Francis Coolidge has joined us. Frank Cunningham. Wonderful to see you all.
Hello, May.
Hi.
Hear nothing.
Hi, Owen.
Michael?
Hello, Michael.
Hi. Good to see everybody.
Hello.
See you.
So what do we think? Are there going to be people coming in a couple minutes late, or is this a good time to start?
Give it a minute or two.
Okay.
We're metaphysicians, like the Owl of Minerva. We always fly a little bit late.
Mm-hmm.
So we're gonna wait till dusk.
Is that someplace, but probably over the Atlantic Ocean now.
Yeah, 5:30 here.
Well, it's always happy hour somewhere in the world.
Okay, let's go.
So before we come into here, I'm sure you all already know this, but just to draw your attention quickly to our quote unquote permissions policy, which is to say this is being recorded, and by staying here, you're implicitly granting the MSA permission to publish your video and audio participation on our MSA website and or other social media platforms, YouTube, what have you. But see the email for more details there. Otherwise, I'm very happy to be able to present today's speaker, which is one Dr. Robert C. Neville, or many of us know him in more friendly way as just Bob, I think. But he's taught at Yale University, Fordham University, State University of New York College at Purchase, and the State University of New York at Stony Brook. He's published numerous books. I won't pretend to go through them, but I think we're going to get something very new from him today. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Bob Neville.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. Glad to David Weissman for starting this series. I hope to start some conversation that will carry on for a bit. My paper today is the first chapter of a book that consists of a joke. I don't know that anybody's going to laugh at the joke, but at least it's intended that way. The joke in part is this. I'm going to talk about what's ultimate, and what's ultimate is, in my theory, really ultimate, really, really, really ultimate. That means that if you start off thinking that we're going to be doing some philosophical theology, that's fine. And you can follow this as philosophical theology. Or if you think that we really are doing what is merely ultimate and not theological in any sense, then that's what this is. I'm going to start reading the paper in just a minute, but it's the point that I want to make is very important. I have worked on this throughout my career. My first book, which came out in 1968, if you can believe, back in the dark ages, to this audience. I published this book in 1968 for the Metaphysical Society. This is an update of that. And it's called Weirdness. Weirdness. And the first few pages begin this way. Being itself is weird. It is strange, surprising, and not what you would expect. But see what I say about this. Being itself is an act, not a thing. Ordinarily, we think of an act as performed by an actor. Yet here I think of an actor as the result of an act, not something prior. An actor that does not act is not an actor. Usually we think of an actor who has acted before, often, with many kinds of character. In these circumstances, it is just fine to call him, her, or it an actor. But in the case of being itself, there is just the singular act. Now, being itself is a creative act. Its product consists of every determinate thing. Every determinate thing. So this creative act cannot be in time, not at all. It is not a first moment followed by others, or a present moment in which all times are included, a kind of totem symbol, nor a future possibility. Because of this, we call the creative act eternal. The creative act is also not in space, not in the north, not at the base of an upside down tree, not floating through empty space. Because of this, we call the creative act immense. Now, immense means unmeasurable in Latin. Because the creative act gives rise to every determinate thing, it contains no determinate characters apart from its products. Apart from what it creates, it is not being, existent, one, good, true, wise, rational, or whatever you might have thought about God or the ultimate. Apart from what it creates, the act is nothing. Conceived as apart from its product, it is indeterminate. Because the creative act creates, its creatures are as necessary as the act that creates them. If there were no creatures, the act would not create them, and therefore would not be the act. So the act and the created creatures together are necessary, given the contingent creation. This is ontological necessity. Suppose there are determinate things or traits that would have to be true no matter what other things are created. These would be the true cosmological transcendentals, if you will. I believe that there are 4 of these traits: form, components formed, existential location, and value. Take it on faith for now that there are these 4. The point at which each of them needs the others, and so that they are cosmologically necessary, is here. Whereas ontological necessity obtains between determinate things and the creative act, cosmological necessity obtains among determinate things. The creative act is immediate. This is to say, it has no structure or process of creation. It just is, including the determinate things as its termini. Time itself is one of its products. The creative act, including its determinate products, is radically contingent. There is no reason or cause for its existence, because all reasons and causes are among its products. Perhaps the weirdest element of the creative act is this: it is contingent. It is not contingent on anything. It just happens. It just is. Nevertheless, the creative act is a movement from nothingness to the determinate things. So it is creation ex nihilo. That immediate movement, lacking steps, is the greatest mystery of all. Fortunately, it has indeed happened, and so we're all relieved. The penultimate step in thinking about this is wonder, seeing how the creative act, including its products, has no necessity in itself. The ultimate step is surprise in realizing that it has happened and that we are in the midst of the determinate things and their creator. The creative act is also ontological. I call it the ontological creative act in order to remind you of its weirdness by the ugliness of its name, and also to call to mind its contact with being itself. As the ontological creative act, being itself is the act including its products, the determinate things. We might think of the determinate things themselves, by themselves and without the act. This is our ordinary way of thinking. We just think about the things or some of the things or some aspect of some of the things, but this is partial. The determinate things are created together, and this requires their ontological context of mutual togetherness. Their cosmological togetherness is constituted by their various relations, and those relations have their reality as the things related. But their ontological context of mutual togetherness includes their essential features that by definition are external to one another. To say that being itself is the ontological creative act is to remind you that it is implicit in any reference to any determinate thing. This ontological creative act is thus the first object of the intellect, as the Western medievals would say. Although mentioned only when doing metaphysics, it is implicit in any reference. Genuinely to know being itself is like aesthetic perceiving. Our usual knowledge is iconic and mapping the reality known. But being itself as a whole does not have a structure to be mapped. Only the determinate things do. So we have to come to perceive being itself, and we can become better at this. This is not weird. It's just about every claim I have made about being itself is weird. If you don't think this is weird, sit back and think about it for a while. It will get to you. And then the rest of the paper gives some reasons for these claims. And I'm open for comments, questions, expressions of weirdness, or anybody who wants to say that they've always known and agreed with this, that's just fine.
Bob, I've always known and agreed with this.
That's,
But no, I think I see George has his hand up.
Robert, this sounds to me, as you said it would, very much like your struggles from long ago in God the Creator. And I'm intrigued at the way you put it this time. It resonates with me at this time in my life for reasons I won't go into, but certainly let me ask this about contingency in creativity. That if the primordial act, the initial act is contingent, is its continued existence, ongoingness, at all affected by what is created? That is to say, is it possible for there not to be a cosmological necessity between the initial act and creatures or beings that may come to be because of it in their own future?
What I want to argue is that there's cosmological togetherness and ontological togetherness. As I described it here, cosmological togetherness is the determinate relations among things that are in the world. And the ontological togetherness is a kind of necessity that obtains between the act and its creature. That is, the creatures are internal to the act, They would not be if they were not created, and the act would not be the creator unless it creates them. So you would not say the ontological creative act is in time at all. It doesn't last. It just is.
Is everlasting or ongoing.
Yeah.
Does the Big Bang that physicists speak of qualify as a physicist's description of what a philosopher would be taught, like you would be talking about in this?
Yeah. Well, of course, I want to talk about cosmological alternatives, and that certainly is one of them. Years ago, when I first began thinking about this theory, I wanted it to apply to all cosmological theories. So the Big Bang at that point, this was now back in the 1960s, early 1960s, was kind of crazy. But I allowed for it. Now, of course, it's there surely is a Big Bang, if not many Big Bangs, if not a zillion Big Bang, and are true, but they're all cosmological. So there's nothing ontological.
Jason, did you have your hand up? We'll go Jason, then Richard, then Francis.
Professor Neville, it's good to hear this. I had a couple questions regarding the essential features that are created together in the ontological context of mutual relevance or togetherness in this paper. How would you describe the relationship between these essential features, which are an expression of ontological difference or absolute distinction from being itself? Is it a process of self-differentiation, pure creation, from which being itself proceeds to the essential features of things? And then the second question I had was regarding aesthetic perceiving that you mentioned. That seemed relatively new, and I was curious about where you're going with that, because it seems to be implicitly relational, that knowledge of being itself as an aesthetic witnessing. So those were my two questions.
Okay, to take the aesthetic question first, I don't see it as particularly relational, except that each of us has a mini version, partial version of the whole. Each of us is different. Each of us is time bound, and so forth. So we just get a partial aspect of that. What's unitary in that is that there's no difference between the object and the partial view of the object that we get in aesthetic vision. And your first question was?
The relationship between the essential features that are created distinct and external to one another and being itself.
Yeah, I don't think that there are essential features that are not also involved with the conditional features. So in order to get things together ontologically, they have to have essential features and also cosmological features. And that is that means that the cosmological togetherness is embraced within ontological togetherness. Now, there is a point at which I didn't talk much in this part of the paper, where I want to say that if you consider the world as a whole and put quotation marks around the whole, and consider only the essential features, all of that is good. and you get evil only when something affects something else in a bad way. One time in a book that I wrote some years ago, I quoted a song from Johnny Cash that said that even the worst of people could get on the train to heaven, because the worst of the people essentially are who they are. Now, that's only part of it. People all are essentially really evil to one another, but I think that doesn't count in the standpoint of the ultimate.
Richard, and then we have Francis, Owen, and then Brian Martine, looks like.
Well, thank you very much. I'm wondering if you are committed to understanding the ultimate act as causal, or since you, I believe, are, how do you understand it as causal? I mean, if it is indeterminate, if being itself is indeterminate, then is it not even prior to causality? And causality would, in some sense, let's say, be what arises from being itself, the mysterious and weird indeterminacy.
Yes, I think that it's not causal in any ordinary sense of causation. So that it has, it's immediate. There is no internal structure to the causation. It's not that the causation is temporal in any sense. It would be a different kind of cause if you're going to say it's a cause. Now, another way of looking at the ontological creative act is to say that it simply is the ontological context of mutual relevance. So it's all things being together as such. And that's with temporal determinations. So things, some are together now, some later, some in the past. So it's not causation in the ordinary sense.
Thanks. I just wonder if there isn't been a gap between being itself and the causal aspects of the world that one has to account for.
No, I don't think that there is a gap there. The causal aspects of things within the world are partial. There are many of them, and so forth. But they all exhibit the properties of being itself. That is, they involve relations between externally related and plus internally related things, I would say.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Francis Coolidge?
Yes, thank you.
How are you?
For a really nice overview of the project that I've been wondering about and reflecting on for years. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to hear you and ask a question. So my first question is, what is the ontological distinction between nothingness and determinate things in the creative act? Is there a duality or a non-duality between these two? If there is a duality, how can there be a unity to being itself, a unity to the isness of the creative act, moving from nothingness to determinate things? If there is a non-duality, what is the difference between the nothingness of the creative act and the determinate things themselves?
That's an excellent question. I think that the answer that I would want to give it is that, just a second. my picture is sort of stopped. But the answer that I want to give is that insofar as there is a difference between the nothingness of the ontological creative act and the determinate, there is not a duality, because the nothingness is nothing, really is nothing, nothing, nothing. You can imagine this now as we're trying to conceive it, and in our imagination, we would have to say that it's indeterminate. So it's a move from indeterminacy to determinacy. But that's only got the determinate things in hand. So that's what I would want to argue.
So then I guess the imaginative problem is seeing why the determinate things either don't collapse into the creativity of being itself, or alternatively, the determinate things just, as it were, soak up the creative act itself.
Say that last part again.
My imaginative problem, my conceptual problem, is really understanding how we can imagine or conceive this fundamental indeterminacy, this nothingness, that nonetheless is the basis in the creative act of what we see to be determinate in the world. The worry is that, or at least the imaginative worry is, preserving some intelligible distinctness between those two that doesn't eventuate in some sort of collapse into one or the other. I guess one way to put the point would be somewhat mystically, right? That in some traditions, there is the claim, as for example in Buddhism, that the determinate things don't really have any being at all, that in the end they are no thing, nothing. And that this is an artifact of sense experience and the way the human mind operates and this sort of thing, that we could sort of generalize ontologically to the worry that the determinate things really don't have any reality to them in light of their origin in indeterminacy. Or conversely, then why aren't the determinate things just there? Sort of thinking of Hesiod's Theogony, just suddenly there are things and there's a gap. What can be packed into the creative act that can hold together both terms? That's what this is what's so weird for me. If you can say more.
If you hold to a Buddhist cosmology, that's something that's to be argued for, but I don't get into that here. If you hold to a yin-yang cosmology in Chinese philosophy, that also is something I don't get into here. If you hold to say an Aristotelian substance cosmology, that's something that's to be argued about. But any of those cosmologies stands in contrast to absolute nothingness. And nothingness is not.
We all lost volume, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Is Bob still even with us?
Lost in nothingness.
Yeah, just
Indeed.
no determinacy.
That's
Stop
weird.
acting.
Bob, if you're here, let us know in the chat, please.
I assume he will try to sign back in as quickly as he can, but
Well, if his video froze, that's usually a bad sign.
well,
Does anyone have his phone number? He may not realize.
I think he did because he noticed that his picture was frozen. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Someone could just take up the thesis, defend it.
I have his email. I could email him.
Maybe send him the link again and let him try to start all over.
Yeah, I'll do that.
I have his telephone number.
Oh, okay.
Shall I try to call it?
Yeah.
At least this used to be his phone number. We'll see. That wasn't it. Bob, David, we've lost your signal. You're neither audibly or visually available to us. Okay, could you go back to the original Zoom code and try that?
And I've resent it to him.
Tyler has just resent the Zoom code to you. Maybe it might be necessary to turn your computer off and start all over again. Okay.
The weird thing is, given Bob's own thesis, this might happen at an in-person conference where he just pops in and out of being for no reason.
I think once things are in being, they stay there. The trick is how they get there.
Ah, well.
He's closing down his circumstances and he will then reboot it.
Circumstances.
Once, when Jerry Garcia broke a string, he said to the audience, "While I'm restringing my guitar, you can chat among yourselves. Or do you even know you have selves to chat to?"
Don't worry about it. We are being philosophic. Yeah, we're very patient.
Yeah, Michael, you said that metaphysicians are always late. Does this mean they're also patient?
What I'm thinking is we're just enjoying the weirdness of the situation.
Staring off into the middle distance, which is what I spend much of my time doing now anyway. So it seems about the same as this.
Francis, had you finished your line of questioning, or you seem to still be in the middle of it?
He doesn't remember now.
Well, I was awaiting response to the follow-up question that I had from Bob, and at that point I lost him. So I hope he might have some things to say, but on the other hand, I want to allow time for the rest of the paper and other people to have an opportunity to talk to. So I'm ready to sign off.
I think, Francis, you could follow up with a question about the duality between his talking and our hearing him.
It certainly is nothing. Yeah.
He's going back now to the Zoom code that Tyler sent him.
Michael, that would be an Entzweiung.
That's what I'm thinking.
But can that which is einerlei be in zweit?
Well, maybe this shows it resists our questioning.
I hear you through the phone. Let me see if is he on the script?
Yeah, I mean, it looks like he's about to hook back in, and
His name is
his
on.
name has reappeared.
Well, it's funny, through the phone, I'm hearing people online, but I'm not yet seeing you. Are you seeing anything? Are you seeing him? Are you seeing Bob?
His name, he's
Yeah.
a black box.
Right.
They see your name, but you're a black box. That's okay. Hearing your voice would be sufficient.
Okay, good. Well,
Okay, fine. We have the black box. Check to see if your camera is
yeah, my camera
in
says
some way.
I cannot start the video.
No.
It may be best to keep the video off so that the bandwidth is not being used up.
Okay, Michael says that it might be better to keep the video off so the bandwidth isn't restricted.
Okay, well,
You're back.
I'm very sorry that I knew that this was going to be a weird paper. But I realized that the weirdness would go all the way down to Zoom. So,
So, Francis, did you want to follow up with something quickly?
No, I'll pause here and I may follow up later. But
Okay. Well, Owen.
thank you, and thank you for the very interesting chapter, and we're all glad that you made it back. I found especially interesting in the chapter was the discussion of the interdependence and the interplay between limit and unlimited, and the way that you refuse to take the ultimate principle to be a principle of the limit. But apart from that, I was reminded by Plato's Philebus and certain strains in the Neoplatonic tradition that understand the creation of things in the cosmos as resulting from the play of principles of limit and unlimited. But as I understand you're making a big departure from that tradition, because for someone like Plato and the Neoplatonists, when we have individual created things, we understand them by virtue of what they have in common, which would itself be a principle of limit. Call it a form, maybe something like Whitehead's eternal objects. But if I'm understanding you, this is just to confirm you're taking the creative act to dispense with that intermediate level, that there's kind of an immediate creation of things from the individual creative act, that we don't need any form or principle of limitedness above the individual thing. So I'd like to clarify that I'm understanding you correctly there.
Yes, you are. Whereas Plato was talking about the conditions of things within life, where we seek moderation and so forth, and was looking at the grounding of that. He was not asking about whether the limit is prior to the unlimited, or the mixture came after the limited and the unlimited. Whereas I don't think he was raising that question there.
Well, he was saying that you've got the limit, you have the unlimited, and then we need another principle, which is the cause of the mixture. But and so presumably there's some kind of causal priority there. But as I'm understanding you, you're asking questions where they don't need to be asked. The limits do what they do, and unlimited principles do what they do together, without any principle of mixture or anything else besides the initial creation.
That's right. What I want to say is that the cause of mixture is itself an antecedent state of affairs that arranges the limit and the unlimited to be the mixture that's at hand. And that's a legitimate problem. And he was, I think, very right to put it that way. That's, I frequently use that myself. But it's not the ontological condition. The ontological condition would ask the relation between the cause of mixture, whatever that might be, and the mixture. So
thank you.
We have Brian, and then Michelle, and then May. But Brian?
Thanks. Bob, I have a question that we first started talking about more years ago than either of us wants to remember, but it seems to be the same one. And I think I didn't hear the beginning of Owen's question, but it seems to me at least directly related to what Richard was asking about and what Francis was, although in different terms. If the ultimate, as you're characterizing it, that is the act, is in its own nature, I realize you might be uncomfortable with that expression. I am myself, but in any case, if it is both contingent and indeterminate, and then somehow out of the act, determinacy and, I take it, necessity, both of which it seems to me are necessary in order to understand what either indeterminacy or contingency means, suddenly appear, then I have the same problem here that I had years and years ago with Hegel, others for whom determinate being seems suddenly to pop into existence out of nowhere after being nothing and becoming are related in the first moment, if you think in terms of the logic. And I guess I still have the same question for you. There's a gap, as Richard was calling it, as Francis was, but the gap is between indeterminacy and determinacy, neither of which it seems to me makes sense without the other. So I'm not sure how we can get from something which is sheerly contingent and indeterminate suddenly to a cosmology that includes somehow determinacy.
Well, given the contingency of things, the ontological creative act is determinate. It's the creator of this world, whatever this world happens to be. So I distinguished between the sheer nothingness and the conceiving of the nothingness, which would have to be as indeterminate. It's not that we're moving from indeterminacy to determinacy. It's that there suddenly appears the determinate world.
Well, if it suddenly appears, then doesn't that indicate some kind of movement toward it?
No, because all movement toward it would be within it. all movement towards anything would be within it.
Now, I see why you have to say that, in as much as there can't be a temporal distinction until you have determinacy. But on the other hand, if one wants to make sense out of saying that something suddenly appears, then that sounds like there are two distinguishable moments, the moment before it appeared and the moment after it has. No?
No, there's no before. There's just after it has appeared, or once it has
If
appeared.
that's the case, then how is it a creative act at all?
What do you have built into your notion of creativity there?
Well, no, it's more the notion of act. I guess that's troubling me here. It seems to me that already implies something like temporality. At least I'm not sure how I can make sense out of the notion of an act independent of that. So
I would want to make sure that there's no temporality in your conception of the act. The act itself, maybe that's a bad word. A few minutes ago, before I stopped being heard, I said that the context of mutual relevance, the ontological context of mutual relevance, is the same thing as the ontological creative act.
Yeah.
Now, the context, that has to do with, say, presence and spatiality, so forth. So I think that's just as problematic as the act. The act is not spatial, it's not temporal. It's just the act of making. And what's made are all the determinate things, externally and internally related to one another.
all right. Okay, well, thanks. I don't want to take up all the time here. So I'm sure somebody else has a question.
Okay.
So Michelle, did you have one? Then May, and then David, it looks like.
Michelle?
Michelle, you're muted.
Oh, sorry about that. Mine is continuous with the last question in the sense that I wanted to know how mutual relevance can describe meaning as valuation in any way if there's a disjunct between act and this manifestation of determinacy somehow. But that's too repeatable. What I'm sorry. What I'm trying to get to right now is that I've been looking at Aristotle on contrariety and his correction of exactly what you described, Robert, or what you described Plato as having. You've got the mixture and you've got limited and unlimited, let's say, and there's no third as such to make something what we would call a triadic activity. And my question is, without a triad in the inception of an ontological way, I guess it's repeated. How can we make this leap to valuation in a determinate form or mutual relevance? I don't know what that means or how it means. Maybe you can help me.
Well, in any kind of a Hegelian triad or Persian triad or whatever kind of triad that you have, you'd be operating within time. And that operation within time also marks the difference between the earlier and the later. And that difference itself is dependent upon the ontological creative act. So time itself, movement, is something that cannot be given an ontological account. It's good, I'm in favor of that, but I cannot give that an ontological account. So perhaps what I'm doing is something different from what Hegel was doing, and verse and so forth. What I'm asking is the ground for any kind of distinction. distinctions, of course, is determinate. And that ground is itself whatever makes that distinction be.
So there's no direct possibility of an explanatory metaphysics for the good as such, for instance,
No.
or love as such, for instance, if this disjunct is in place between the ontological and then what becomes determinate, right?
That's right, yes.
Okay, thank you.
It's not that I'm against that. And I wrote a book called The Metaphysics of Goodness.
Yes, I know. Yes, of course.
It is sort of stuff about goodness. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
May.
Yes, thanks so much, Bob. This has been a very enjoyable talk. And I'm wondering about the weirdness that you're talking about here. And it seems that you're presupposing a particular perspective from us that makes your description of being itself weird, or your philosophizing about being itself weird. And I'm wondering if you could say a little more about that perspective that, you know, I'm attributing that you're presupposing. And if it is the case then that if we completely understand your view of being itself, that it might no longer be weird to us? Or is it going to always be weird?
So let me give a historical answer to that. When I first began thinking about these things, I had the basic idea of, in my first book, God the Creator, of a God who was eternal in this sense. But I didn't realize how different my mode of thinking was there. And now I have come to say that their philosophy is a kind of picturing of the world, and it's a picturing that picks up on the contingency of the determinate things and the necessity that they have for there being the creative act, and the creative act itself is contingent. Now, that perspective has come to me from lots and lots and lots of different angles, and I think it's very important. So I suppose that I am asking you to think in ways other than other philosophers have thought, with the exception of Tyler, who agrees with me on this. So are my arguments persuasive? There are 3 very large volumes that argue this in my philosophical theology. There's the volume on goodness that argues this. So those are all different ways. Now, is it hard to understand? Well, it is if you want to keep with the old ways of thinking. But that's what I don't want to do. Is that helpful?
Yes, it is. And if I might follow up with perhaps, you know, a more traditional question, and that is that if being itself is nothing determinate apart from its products, what's the big deal?
It's just the way it is. That's the big deal. That's why you need to have an aesthetic vision of it. Now, you wouldn't be able to get all the products together under a super third. That goes back to Michelle's comments. And you wouldn't be able to get it in a minimal kind of trait like being, which applies to each thing. But you would just have to see it. And is that a big deal? No, it depends on whether you want to solve the problem with the one of the many problem of being itself, and so forth.
All right, thank you.
David, did you have a question?
Yes, I have a couple of quick things. The last paragraph of the paper is about an indexical theory of meaning, in which Bob points out that perhaps one can merely allude to what he's trying to talk about, so that the attempt to make him literal won't work, given what he takes to be the weirdness of the issue. But I think there are a couple of things that can be made explicit. Given the weirdness and given your sense that the issue can merely be pointed at, I personally distrust most of the words that I'm hearing discussed. And I have a simpler question. If everything comes from nothing, why this particular something? What was sufficient in being, which was nothing, to determine that it should be this world rather than one of the infinity of alternative worlds? So if it is the case that something comes from nothing, then the question is only half answered, because the other half of the question is, why this particular something? Then I have a further question or two, but let's start there.
Okay, that's an excellent question. And I think the answer to it is that we can't know anything more about why this world is as it is than we would find from the cosmological relations. So we go back and we find particular causes of this or that, and future causes, and context within context, and so forth. And we find a lot of reasons for why there's this world. But there also might be things that are spontaneous. And those things, that is, things that arise in the present that do not have an antecedent cause. And that depends upon your cosmology. So then I don't believe that there is necessarily anything particularly important about that.
Odd. Non-being, nothing, produces all that is,
right?
And yet without a sufficiency in itself to determine that it be this something rather than one of the innumerable other possible somethings. That's odd.
Exactly.
A different question. I don't know how many people have read the paper, but this is the last paragraph on page 8. And forgive me if I read just a sentence or two so that I don't seem to be talking in the blue. To refer to an ontological context of mutual relevance is not an innocent phrase. The issue is that anything that is determinate has to be within the context, not the context itself. The context itself if the context itself were something determinate, then it would have to have essential components outside of the matrix of determinate things. This would require the context itself and the things within the context to be in yet a larger or deeper context. So the ontological context of mutual relevance cannot itself be determinate. Well, I want to point out something which I think isn't in this paragraph. This is the one argument in the paper, the one paragraph that argues why something must come from nothing. Namely, determinacy must come from non-determinacy, indeterminacy. There is a simple principle that goes like this. Whatever is not a contradiction is a possibility. That is, anything we can conceive without contradiction, that's not just a logical conceiving, I mean a psychological conceiving, it's a logical conceiving. It goes with Wittgenstein's remark in the Tractatus, I'll read it to you quickly. The facts in logical space of the world. This is 1.13. The facts in logical space of the world. That is, logical space comprises all the possibilities of which there are an infinity, and they are eternal because nothing within them is contradictory. Nothing within them causes them to be, they simply are. So the determinacy of our world comes from a nexus of determination, namely the nexus of all logical possibilities. There are two questions. Why this world? I don't have an answer. And what creates the many possibles? I don't have an answer for that either. But nothing creates the many possibilities. They're there infinitely. Now, that's a completely different cosmological answer from yours, Bob. So I ask you, why do you suppose that determinacy comes from indeterminacy when, according to this principle, whatever is not a contradiction is a possibility, provides for an infinite inventory of determinations, irrespective of the possible world that is instantiated?
The answer that I would give to that is that in the infinite possibilities, they are determinate with regard to one another, and therefore, as a whole, need to be created.
What if the only thing that stands in the way of their existence as possibles is that they would embody a contradiction, and yet they're conceivable, they are the facts in logical space, they don't embody a contradiction, and hence were never created. All you're doing is supposing that anything that is in any way determinate needs creation, yet these don't. So is there a different question? Is that a psychological need for which you're arguing, or a logical need? That is it logically required that they be created, or is it a psychological paradigm which makes us think that nothing precedes being? Maybe nothing doesn't precede being.
Well,
I'm sorry. Yes, maybe being doesn't presuppose nothing. Pardon me for talking fast.
Oh, no. I think the time is coming up. I would say that anytime that you have a complexity, that's the ontological question. What is the ground of the complexity? This is now the Chinese argument that's pretty clear and explicit. The only thing that can account for many different things is absolute non-being. The Chinese conceive this probably mainly temporally, but I don't. So I would say, given the structure of the logical world, that means that there is the creation. It has taken place, or is taking place, or whatever you want to say about it. But that's not to say that there is not a question to raise as to how that's possible. Possible because it's actual.
And yet all of that comes down to the idea, which some of us still find difficult, that everything comes from nothing, where nothing has neither properties nor powers.
Right, that's right.
We're stuck with the I think one of the, frankly, the powerful paragraphs in this paper is the last paragraph on indexical theories of meaning. We're left to, you're pointing at something, and that's my last question. Is that something to which you're pointing a psychological need or a logical one? That the answer you just gave, we need to explain whatever is determinate. Maybe not.
Why not? Sir?
If it's eternal and necessary, it doesn't need explaining.
Why not? It seems to me that it does, because it's complex. Anything that's complex needs explaining.
Well, I'm thinking of people who believe that you explain the existence of the creator by saying it has necessary being.
Well, that's
It is not obvious that complexity of every sort has to come from something other than itself, namely, in particular, that which has neither properties nor powers, non-being. That seems to be a paradox.
it
More
probably
paradoxical than the idea that determination is eternal and necessary.
I think that you have the great alternative to my theory, but my theory presses the question of ontological structure back one more step. And so that's why I would say that being, the beings of things depends upon the act of creating them. Without their being created, and you're right, we've got them. Without their being created, there's nothing. And of course, we wouldn't even know that.
Thank you.
So I do want to be mindful of people's time, and of course we're at 2:07 by my clock, but I also wasn't sure if Friedrich Wilhelm had a question that he posed in the chat that he wanted to follow up on or not. And I'll take that as no. I want to thank everybody for their time, but particularly Bob. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
And these will probably, our Zoom seminars in metaphysics will go on a hiatus for the summer, but we'll return after the summer, I believe is the plan. So I do want to remind people, and I can send out an email to places eventually too to remind people, but that you can submit papers that would fit in the appropriate time slot. And then we have a vetting committee that will make decisions and the like. And so bear that in mind.
We'll be back in September. Owen had suggested in September that he would prefer that we start at 3 rather than 4, because Friday is the beginning of the Sabbath for him, for some of us. And so we will start a Friday 3 near the end of September. I'm not sure which date that will be, but 20 something of September at 3 o'clock. And Tyler will let us know.
Good.
We'll need a paper.
Okay.
Good. Well, thank you, everybody, then, and we'll see you in September, if not sooner.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Bob.
Bob, thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Bill?
I have to remember sitting in your class in 1968, listening to you when God the Creator came out.
Right.
A wonderful return.
That's good.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Good to see you, Francis.